Welcome. I'm Sarah Davis, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm the 4-H agent in Sarasota County, and we're here with DeSoto and Sarasota's Lunch and Learn Day 2 on storm preparedness. Just a quick note, this workshop is being recorded and may be used for future educational programming. You and your parent completed a waiver consenting to the recording, so if you have any concerns with being recorded or do not wish to be recorded, you can keep your video off and your audio unmuted. So just like most of our 4-H meetings, we're going to start our meeting with the pledges. So if you want to go ahead and stand, we'll start with the pledges. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, for liberty and justice for all. And now let's go ahead with the 4-H pledge. I pledge my head to clearer thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, and my health for better living for my club, my community, my country, and my world. So we're super excited to have you all today, and we've got a couple of folks joining us. So I'll go ahead and let the adults that are not presenting go ahead and introduce themselves. Go ahead, Juliana.
Hello, I am Juliana Costanzo, and I am the 4-H Youth Development Intern with UF IFAS Sarasota County, and I am super excited to be here today.
And Kelly?
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm the Sarasota County 4-H Program Assistant, and I'm also excited to be here today.
And then joining us today, we have Caitlin Mullenix, our 4-H agent in DeSoto County, as our special speaker, and along with John Court, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Animal Industry District 5 Supervisor. And so they're going to be sharing with us some amazing information to keep us all prepared for storms and our agricultural projects. I'll send it over to you, Caitlin and John.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared with you so you can follow along today. We're excited to be here to share some disaster preparedness, whether you're preparing yourself or maybe you have some 4-H projects that you already have at home. So we have some wonderful tips today in order to keep both yourself and your project safe during these times. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Caitlin Mullenix. I am the 4-H agent here in DeSoto County. And I am also joined by John Court, and I'll let him introduce himself and what he does.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Court. I'm with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Division of Animal Industry, Bureau of Animal Disease Control, and I'm the District 5 Supervisor. I'm part of the State Agriculture Response Team that responds to natural disasters and animal disease outbreaks.
So today, of course, we are sitting in the middle of hurricane season, and we all are very well aware that June 1st through November 30th is hurricane season here in Florida. August through October just tend to be the most active months. And before we met with you, we were actually looking at the tropics and looking at a small storm that's forming out in the Atlantic right now. So we're kind of monitoring that as well as giving you guys tips as we're facing those issues today. So if you will, with us, before we get started and talk about preparing our hurricane supply kit, I would like to know if you could only bring 5 items or only add 5 items to your hurricane supply kit, what would they be? So if you can go join or open a browser, to menti.com and enter the code 841499, and you will have the option to enter 5 different items that you would bring or add to your hurricane supply kit. So we'll give you just a second or a couple minutes. And if you're not live with us today, that's okay as well. Maybe you're watching this in a future time. Just think to yourself, what are 5 items that you would put in your hurricane supply kit? So maybe these are items that you know about from learning about hurricane preparedness before. Maybe these are just items off the top of your head that you would grab in a quick pinch. But we're just curious what you would have in your kit. So we have a flashlight, a sleeping bag, a book, medicines just popped in. We have canned food, snacks, soap, water. Water is very important. We're going to talk about that. So all really good things to put into your hurricane supply kit. Very good. So if you still have more, no worries, you can keep adding them. We've got a really good kit already prepared on the screen for us. And we're going to explore a little bit later what are some other items that we can add to our hurricane supply kit to keep us comfortable and safe during those times. So we'll go ahead and switch right back on over. So before any major weather event, it's really important that we do 3 things. First, we need to have a plan. The second thing we need to think about is having that hurricane supply kit or disaster preparedness kit, depending on where you're located or what you might be facing. And then the third thing, just like I mentioned before, we want to stay informed. So it may just be a quick flip on the phone and look and see what's going on with that storm, but we definitely want to stay connected as much as possible because that's going to help us be more prepared. So have a plan. We need to figure out what are we going to do during the storm. So we always want to know, where is our family going to shelter? Are we going to shelter at home? Are we going to rely on maybe a friend or neighbor's home? Or are we going to rely on a public shelter that opens up to keep us safe? And there's a lot of factors that go into deciding where we're going to stay. We need to look at flood zones and keeping in mind flood insurance for parents. We need to remember that we can protect our homes, and we'll get into that. We need to locate the safest place in our home if we decide to stay there. So we don't want to be in a room that has a lot of open windows. If they're not boarded up, most of the time we try to find an interior room with no windows to keep us the safest during a hurricane. We always want to make sure that we have that important paperwork. And we want to have it in a waterproof container if available. That way, if we do have some sort of damage to our structures, we can at least keep our important paperwork as safe as possible. And of course, this year, as we battle hurricane season, we all know that COVID-19 is very prevalent in our areas. So now we need to also take into consideration so if we plan to leave our home, do we need to pre-register for a shelter? Do we need to bring our own face coverings? Do we need to bring our own linens? So there's a lot of new ideas that are coming into play this year because not only are we facing hurricanes, but we also have COVID-19 safety concerns as well. So not only do we have to think about us, but a lot of us at home have pets or livestock, 4-H projects. So we have to have a plan for them. They can't quite defend themselves sometimes when it comes to hurricanes. So maybe we need to check and see where our pet-friendly shelters are. Not every shelter allows you to bring your cats or dogs. And of course, it's going to be a little hard to bring a cow or a horse or maybe a small animal into shelters. So we want to think about that. So where are we going to house maybe those horses and cattle and other farm animals? So just to get you thinking, we always want to start out with having a plan. So we can shutter up the house, but what about the barn? So Mr. John Court is here with us today, and I know that he has experienced many storms where he's had to make the decision of, where am I going to keep my livestock safe during this storm? So a question for John is, where, in your opinion, is the safest place for me to keep my livestock during a hurricane?
Well, it's a lot of personal opinion. If you have a lot of acreage where you could turn your animals out and they're on a sufficient amount of acreage, but they could get out in the middle of it and may not be hit by flying debris, some people believe that's the best place to do them, because animals do tend to survive very well on their own. If you have small acreage, like 5 or 10 acres, you're going to be a little more prone to putting them in a barn or stalls or something of that nature that would protect them from flying debris. As you know, it's a natural disaster and anything may happen, but I do believe that if you're in small acreage, you need to try to plan to shelter them as good as possible. It is a lot of flying debris, a lot of it. So if they're in something that'll keep the debris from hitting them, most of the time they're in pretty good shape.
Very good. So no matter whether you decide to stay at home or evacuate, just keep in mind, animals should never be left behind without a plan, because again, they are not able to defend themselves or sometimes find the proper structure or safe zones. So we always want to keep in mind what we're going to do with our pets in case of an emergency. So if we decide to evacuate, a lot of things come into play. One, when should we evacuate? So we always think we need to leave early. If we wait too long, everybody knows that the interstates and those main evacuation routes, they tend to get congested. So 72 hours is typically the least amount of time you want to give yourself to evacuate. And then, of course, what if we don't have up-to-date paperwork on our animals or our livestock that's required to transport them? So John, help us out. What happens if I don't have my health certificate in date and I need to move my livestock?
Usually in a state of emergency, the health regulations will be waived. You're allowed to travel freely, but at times you get into another state and coming back in, you may have to obtain a health certificate to come back in. Usually the adjoining states will honor the state of Florida's emergency decree or whatever, and it has to be declared emergency. And they do waive a lot of the health requirements.
Absolutely. That doesn't mean to say that keeping your animals' papers up to date, that is probably the most important thing that you can do preparing your livestock in projects for hurricane season. Even though you may not anticipate traveling with them, it's always good to have information on those animals.
Vaccination records, because you may get to a facility that will require those vaccinations to be housed in the facility. So it would be prudent of you to get your vaccination record of your horses or cattle to have with you so that you can prove that they've been vaccinated.
Absolutely. So if we have our paperwork and we're good to go, what else should we travel with? And we'll go into a little bit more detail with this information too on the next couple slides. But if I'm bringing my pets or livestock, we need to think about, what do those pets or livestock require in the time that we're going to be gone. So if I'm packing a bag and I'm leaving for 3 days, I would like, but in the case of a hurricane, we have to bring all of that with us. So if you're going to evacuate water, keep in mind maybe a first aid kit in case an injury occurs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And then, of course, where in the world am I going to bring those animals? So it's always important to know before you go. So don't just hit the road and expect to be able to find somewhere to unload and keep large animals safe. Smaller animals may be a little bit easier to stow, but when it comes to horses and cattle, they tend to be a little bit harder to offload and keep them safe in certain places. So, John, if I'm looking for somewhere to shelter an animal in a time like this, are there places that would welcome in my horse or maybe 1 or 2 head of cattle?
There has been some designated facilities. Most of the time you can find them on the FDAC's website, and it'll tell you the contact information, what the requirements are, and when it will open, and if there's a fee or not.
Very good. So there are places do tend to be places available, and that's where knowing before you go is important. So make sure that you check out that Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services website, and they have lots of great resources for disaster preparedness when it comes to preparing your livestock. So this is geared a lot towards 4-H members, and maybe that's not exactly what you can do as a 4-H'er, but there's a lot of things that you can do to help out when we're preparing for a storm. So always keep in mind, anything that's left in the yard becomes a projectile if the wind picks up. So a way that you can help as a 4-H youth is lend a helping hand. Pick up your toys in the yard or bikes. Maybe you have play equipment that you keep out year round. Help your parents out by picking up that and storing it in a safe place, maybe in a shed or a garage. Or if you don't have either of those, bring it inside, because remember, the wind will always pick up anything that's left in the yard. So if you have small animal cages or maybe some loose objects, maybe you keep a rake next to your pen. You want to make sure that any loose objects in your barn or around your animals' cages or pens, you want those stowed away as well. We don't want the wind to catch them. We don't want something that we could have just stuck into the tack room or the barn to fly around and injure our animals. Of course, some of us may have some potted plants. Here in DeSoto County, we have about 50 youth with citrus trees. So potted plants, if we can move them indoors, that's probably the safest place for them. However, that's not always an option. But if you can move them close to your house, help with shielding some of that wind, they tend to stay pretty safe. As well as if you have very large potted plants that maybe you can't drag them. If you're able to tip them over, a lot of times you can protect those plants by tipping them over into the wind, and they'll weather a little bit better. So, identification. We all know that we have to have some sort of tag or tattoo, or maybe even a microchip on our animals for fair projects. That way we can check them in. But what about those horses that are standing in the road? How in the world are we going to know who they belong to? So, Mr. Court, what do you think about identifying animals in the case of a natural disaster?
Well, it's always good if we find loose animals, if we get a phone number. So the name, all that stuff is good and extra, but if a phone number's there, we can call that phone number. And one of the problems we do have during a hurricane is lack of communication. It's probably the #1 problem during a hurricane. So don't be surprised. A lot of us will put animals in a safe place behind the fence. We'll do the best we can to take care of them until we can locate an owner. It's prudent of yourself, if you will, make sure those animals are housed in a place they can't get away. But as we know, trees fall on the fence is down, the animals are trying to be safe, and they do get out. So, but we do, if we can get a phone number, that I would say that's the #1 thing. If you have room to put it somewhere on your animal, waterproof tag or something, You can get paint sticks at the feed store. Write your phone number on the side of your horse, or put a weatherproof tag and write on it in weatherproof ink, because it's going to rain, it's going to get nasty, and we do find a lot of times animals with no identification. We put them in a place, and we eventually will find the owners, but it takes a while sometimes, and then we wind up having to take care of them, and it really taxes our resources.
So what happens if I'm driving down the road one day and I come across these horses and nobody else is around? Who should I call to make aware of animals outside of their fence?
If possible, if you can call the sheriff's department first, and they will get a hold of somebody with the livestock, ESF 17, the animal care emergency support function, and we'll do our best to get somebody there. And if possible, if you're able, if you could get them inside a gate or a fence, it's very important, because we don't want anybody hurt running into an animal. So if you're not unable, a phone call. If you're able, turn your flashers on so somebody knows that there's something wrong coming up behind you in a vehicle or something. So, just the standard safety precautions as much as possible.
Absolutely. So that identification, very good. I know back when Irma hit, we had a couple of youth who had Project Animals, and we took one of the base and we literally wrote our chapter name and we wrote a contact phone number on the side, because each of those kids had those projects at their house, and we weren't sure exactly how everything was going to weather. So that's definitely a really good option. And like John said, make sure you have a phone number so that we can get in contact with you if need be.
And those can be purchased at any Tractor Supply or feed store. They have paint sticks that are animal identification markers.
Absolutely. As well as those flap tags, you can just use a generic flap tag. I've seen individuals braid flap tags into the horse's mane. So that's always an option. And then you hung up on down fences or down trees. We never know exactly what is going to happen in the case of a hurricane or any part of that hurricane, with tornadoes, the wind, the rain, the floodwaters. So we want to keep that in mind as we are marking our animals, is we're not putting something on them that could also get hung up and put them in harm's way when we thought we were actually protecting them.
Cotton string works real good. It will break if it is extremely pulled on. It's pretty safe. It won't cut like some of the other strings, but it really works good, and it's breakable in the event of something getting caught on. So that's another thing you can try.
Absolutely. So keep in mind, if you ever have any questions on how to identify your animals, we are always here in the Extension office. You can contact your local Department of Ag. You have an inspector who covers your area, and we would all be very willing to help you out if you need more advice on how to identify your animals in a disaster preparedness scenario. So now we get to that building a kit that we talked about. So we're prepared for the storm. We have our animals situated, we know what the plan is, but now we have to go one step further, and now we have to build a kit to provide supplies to keep us going for hopefully no more than 3 days, but sometimes you never know. You can be without power for quite a while, depending on where you're located. So it's recommended that you prepare enough food and water for each person in your family for at least 3 days. It would be much more beneficial if you could do up to 7 days. That way you're not scrounging if you don't get those supplies back right away. And just a few common things that you should have in your kit for yourself. So here we're just talking about human needs and not necessarily livestock needs, but we will go into that next. So keep in mind, you want to have non-perishable foods. If we lose electricity, that gallon of milk or those Go-Gurt snacks in the refrigerator, they're not going to be good for very long. So with perishable foods, don't forget to grab that can opener unless you have the quick pop tops, because that's a common thing that most people will forget, and then your food is no good if you can't break into it. Water, you should have a gallon of water per person per day. So make sure that you bring plenty of water with you. Flashlights, of course, that was one of the items as well that was on our first list. If you have flashlights and a battery-powered radio, of course, you're going to want some extra batteries depending on how long you may be without power. It's always important to have your prescription medications nearby, and then have a first aid kit. Just with simple supplies in case you do get cut or injured, you can get yourself back to health and keep yourself protected. If you have young children in your family, formula and diapers are super important. And then, of course, if you're staying home, paper goods, make sure to have those because washing dishes might be a little difficult. And if you're visiting a shelter or leaving your home for any reason, be sure to bring some clothes and possibly linens. So that is not an entire list, but that's just a very brief list of items that you should have in your supply kit. And of course, FEMA has more extensive supply lists that you can definitely check out at ready.gov, as well as lots of disaster preparedness. So keep in mind your kit may differ a little bit depending on where you shelter, what your needs are, but make sure you at least have food, water, and some basic supplies to keep you going for a few days. As we look at our livestock, so they can't really prepare their own supply kits, and they're going to look so much different than what we need. Most cattle are not going to survive off of a gallon of water per day. So what in the world is a supply kit going to look like for some of our small projects? So when we think about our rabbits or poultry projects, of course, feed and water are the most important. When we think about the small animals, we're going to want to try to bring them in if we can, or close to a building so that they're nice and protected. But it would be helpful as well to have a carrying case in case you do have to load them and go. Dogs and cats, many people travel to shelters with their dogs and cats. Of course, you're going to have to provide your own food and water. Make sure that you have a kennel for your dog or your cat to go in with traveling. And then, of course, any other items that they may need, including bags to clean up after their mess. When we're traveling with horses, we get into a little bit more supplies that with even horses and cattle, we can kind of group them together. Of course, we're going to need to bring water, but again, a horse or a cow is not going to survive off of 1 gallon of water. So on the right-hand side is a nice little table. Know that water consumption varies drastically depending on where you're located, what your weather conditions are. But a good rule of thumb is per 1 cow to have 7 to 18 gallons of water. So that's a lot of water to travel with. Horses, they're about the same, 8 to 18 gallons. And then some of our small ruminants, sheep and goats, they don't require as much water, but water tends to be a limiting factor when it comes to caring for livestock after the storm.
One of the most important things and the things we have the most trouble with is water.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is people are reliant on electricity to pump water, and excuse me, I have it turned off. They're reliant on electricity to pump water,
Mm-hmm.
and water tends to be hard to get out of the ground without electricity. So it's very important that you think about the water way ahead of time. Can you fill up your pool and dip buckets out of it? Make sure your water troughs are completely full. If they have a pond, Remember that in a flooding situation, that the water tends to get contaminated. So you have to be careful of that. But you know, we all know that it's what we can do, the best we can do. But if you're reliant on pump water, you need to do something ahead of time, because the electricity is going out during the hurricane. So water is the #1 criteria. They can live without feed for a few days. They cannot live without water. So water is the most important thing there is. It's hard to travel with water. If you're going to travel, you need to get out ahead of time, and usually you can find water. Something that's very important, and you can ask your horse extension specialist about flavoring your water ahead of time. Get the animals used to drinking a flavored type water, a Coca-Cola or Gatorade, some little something you can add. Kool-Aid. You can add just a little bit to the water to give it a flavor, so that when you travel to other destinations and they don't like the water, you can put a little bit of that in there and they'll drink it.
Very good technique. A few other things that you might think about when you're preparing a supply kit for any of your animals or livestock. And we haven't hit on the plants quite yet, but keep in mind you may want to have just a basic first aid kit for your animals. We talked about flying debris. We talk about, we could have down fences. We could have cattle who are in a piece of metal or something that could cut them or puncture them. So it's always important to just have a basic first aid kit that you can tend to any wounds that you might find on some of your animals. Now that kind of is geared more towards your project animals. Now, I don't expect anyone to wade out into the cow pastures and make sure that every single cow in the pasture underwater is okay, but that's something that we have to deal with as we can get to those animals. So make sure that you have at least some basic first aid materials, some scissors, an antiseptic to clean, some soap. A hoof pick would be good if you're traveling with your horse or you have your horse around in case they get into something that could get wedged up into their hooves. But make sure that you're prepared with first aid materials.
And as with the human side, it's very important that if your animal, some of your smaller domestics, your rabbits, your poultry, your dogs and cats, if they're on a daily medication, you need to make sure you have plenty of that to last you a week or two, because we may not be able to get medicine to you. And you need to think about, does it need to be cold? If it's refrigerated medicine, you need to think about having it in a small cooler with some ice packs or something like that. Normally, in a shelter situation, you can get a little more ice to put on your, if medications are important. Crates, a plastic crate. You can put several chickens in a crate. I wouldn't do it in a flood area, but if you are going to travel with them, dogs and cats are required to have a crate when they go to the shelter. So that is extremely important. So you need to think about all these things. And please remember that 90% of the time you're going to be without electricity for at least 48 hours. If you travel and go to a shelter, they're powered by generators. But then you still have your animals, a couple gallons of water for them, just to have it in the event that there's not enough to go around, because people are first. So,
absolutely. So, yep, prepared for 48 hours or 2 days without electricity in the best case scenario. If you are a 4-H member who has a plant project, maybe you do tomato projects or a citrus tree, or you have a garden, keep in mind that those projects are going to need a little bit of water. Fortunate for us, those hurricanes bring some rain, so we may not have to rely on a lot of stored water for them. But the best thing you can do is keep those plants close to a building, keep them out of the wind, because that's what tends to either cause fruit drop or tear leaves, limbs to break. So we want to just make sure that we're covering all of our 4-H projects and not leaving one or the other out. So keep in mind, those supply kits, you do want to update them, because just like you and I, sometimes those prescriptions change or our pet needs change as they get older. And of course, always check and make sure that you don't have expired items hanging around in that first aid kit. All right, so the third part about disaster preparedness is staying informed. So we hit on it earlier, and we were just checking our phones before we started just to see what in the world is the tropical depression or tropical storm out in the Atlantic going to do. So we want to stay informed. There's national and local weather alerts that you can sign up for, and those are always wonderful. The national ones, when you sign up for them, you put in where you live, and they will gear those alerts towards your area. If you live here in DeSoto County, we have DeSoto Alert, and definitely check out your county pages, web pages, because they will keep you up to date as well. Make sure if you are looking for answers or you need help, most of the time in a case of emergency, your counties will open up a local call center. So be sure to utilize those if you need resources or you need help or need maybe directions to a shelter or where to go if your home is not a safe place to live. Those are always wonderful resources for you in your counties. Of course, track the storm so you don't have to be glued to the news, but make sure that you're keeping up to date and you know exactly where that cone of uncertainty is going and what time a storm is expected to reach your general area. The more you stay informed, the more prepared you can be for that oncoming hurricane. All right, so the storm is come and gone, and now what in the world are we supposed to do? We prepared, we stayed informed, we had our kit, we experienced the event. So now after the storm, it's a whole nother ball game. The best thing that you can do after a storm is follow your local officials' guidance. So if there's a curfew put in place, make sure that you're obeying that curfew. If you're asked to not be on the roads, there's a reason that you don't want to be on the roads. They're not safe to be traveled. So following that local guidance from your county officials, our state officials, that's always important. We always want to keep our own health in mind when we are cleaning up from a hurricane. We live in the great state of Florida, the Sunshine State, so we want to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from UV rays, from heat. We want to drink plenty of water after a storm if we're outside cleaning up. Of course, we want to make sure that we're avoiding floodwaters because we don't know what's under those floodwaters. Those power lines could be hanging under there. There could, like we talked about with our livestock, there could be barbed wire or sharp objects. So we always want to try to avoid floodwaters. Of course, electrical equipment, electricity and water, they do not mix very well. So make sure that you're not touching any electrical equipment in your home or around your home, especially if it's wet, you are wet, or you happen to be standing in water. So keep that in mind. With most 4-H'ers, you probably shouldn't be touching the electrical stuff anyways, but make sure that you are being very vigilant when it comes to electronics and water. Of course, for your parents, they're going to be documenting damage from that storm. That's important after a hurricane or a natural disaster. And then cell phone service, sometimes if you've gone through a storm, you can't get a phone call out after a hurricane hits because our phone lines are so caught up with responders communicating. So always limit your cell phone use. Definitely make sure that you're checking in with your loved ones. But if you don't have to be on the phone, leave that line open for somebody else who may need it a little bit more than
You may think of thing I can protect for when we're responding, mosquitoes. There is a big mosquito hatch when we have a hurricane or flood. And so when you're outside, it's very important to try to spray and keep the mosquitoes off of you. You may even think like a cell phone, buying something that would be like a flashlight, a jumper box, and it has a USB port to keep your cell phone battery up in the event. A lot of the cell towers, if they're not damaged, they do have generators now. So there is, but it is crammed full of emergency response, and you may get out. You may take your plan, write it down, put it in your house in a waterproof folder or something of that nature, because in the event of a hurricane, responders stop by. They check your house. If it's damaged, they're looking for people. If you have a plan that says we went to Alabama or Georgia, they immediately they can go on to the next place and hopefully help somebody in really need of help.
Absolutely.
So just some ideas.
Absolutely. Those are wonderful ideas. So not only are we protecting ourselves after the storm, but we have to think about our livestock and our 4-H projects. So John mentioned that he was a member of the State Agriculture Response Team. So share with us, what is SART?
SART is a group of non-governmental agencies and governmental agencies that have come together. There's over 45 different agencies involved. The State Agriculture Response Team responds to natural disasters. We help facilitate providing equipment, making sure the resources get out into the public. We have stayed in where the direct damage of the storm. We set up staging areas where we get in resources and we hand them out, we track them, and we respond to people like don't have water, they don't have feed, their fence is down. We try to get resources allocated to them, handed out.
Absolutely. So where can we typically find those supplies after a storm? Are we able to just drive up and get everything we need, or how should we try to get supplies after the storm for our animals?
So one of the hardest things is right after hurricane is access to a facility. We tend to have those planned out ahead of time, and we know we get in usually an extension office to handle our incident command team, and then it's a command post in the team. Then we have staging areas in different areas, whoever's the hardest hit, and we ship resources direct to them. So you would have to try to get on the website. You can call the extension office, you can call your county's emergency operations center, and they would have wherever the resources are being stored. And remember that resources are limited during this situation, and thank God to the United States of America, everybody donates, it comes, and we help get it out. There's a very, the United States is really great about donating to people in need, but there is not a lot to cover everybody. So we have to monitor it, and we try to make resources go as far as we can. You can't get everything you want. If we have it, we give it out in limited supplies, get it by another day or two. The one thing we don't want to do is cripple the infrastructure. Your feed stores, the guy you buy feed from every day, he's been through the storm too. He may have feed he needs to sell and get out of the warehouse. So it's very important. We're here to help, but we're not here to take over. And we expect owners of pets and livestock to be resourceful. You know, we're there to help if we can.
Yep. So always check with your local feed store. Make sure that you have purchased enough feed before the storm, because again, supplies are limited.
And keep your feed secure. Try to keep it in a waterproof container. You may have to tie the lids down. Put it in your horse trailer, stock trailer. You don't want the lid to blow off and be ruined by the water, which we all know we're going to get. It's a hurricane, and you need to prepare.
Absolutely. So typically, I know here in DeSoto County, our supply spot is right behind our extension office at the Turner Center, and that tends to cater to both livestock supplies as well as human supplies, so personal needs as well. We touched on water a little bit earlier. When it comes to after the storm and we don't have a generator to run our well, we didn't fill our bathtub or our pool for buckets of water. So is SART able to help out with providing some water until we're able to get our water needs situated?
So we have a limited resources to supply water. We have a couple of 250-gallon water tenders that we can pull and get water. If you have 250 head of cows, we're going to have trouble. We can fill up, 250 gallons. And as you saw, 18 gallons per head, per day, water goes fast. Normally, the flood waters run off fast enough, and if they're not too contaminated, they can drink that. But the biggest problem we find is no electricity, and they can't pump water. So think about that when you're preparing. You may want to make sure your generator can run your well. We do have ways. We've employed the fire departments to get water from them. They have, and the forestry division of forestry has big water tankers that they can bring water. We can get water. It's just how much and how fast.
Absolutely.
But we do. That's one of our biggest issues is water.
Very good. So supplies are always going to be limited, and that's where being prepared before the storm is the most important part of the message, is be ready for it. And there's always help if you do have a shortfall or what have you.
Be part of the solution.
Absolutely. So I pulled a couple pictures to share with you from some of our recent storms. So this one, as we look at it, it's a little odd. The law enforcement is taking hay and shavings, it looks like, out on the river. So sometimes we have to call in our state and law enforcement officers. And what you're looking at here is they are delivering supplies to animals who are stuck in those floodwaters.
Okay.
So this was during Hurricane Irma. In our area, we had more water than we knew what to do with. So this was a very common scene here in the DeSoto County area. And there were lots of livestock that they had to be cared for. And too deep of water to get to by vehicles. Or a couple of horses. Would you like to explain what's going on here, Mr. John?
What happened here is that the river overflowed and it overtook the owner and the animals before they could get the animals moved. I thought this was a very ingenious way of feeding their horses hay. It was so deep that they had to use boats and airboats to get to this facility. It wasn't too much longer, like 3 days. They were able to swim the horses out. And remind yourself that they got to be careful of barbed wire fences, gates, and any floating debris that's floated or fell. Right here, you can see that there's fences around them. The debris can't hit them. So feeding them in place now, we all know water's not good for horses on an extended problem, but this was really, and they actually within 2 days got these horses loaded out, and it was a really good scenario. But you can see whoever it was really smart putting the hay in the boat.
That's it.
It was a really good idea.
So they floated a nice, if you haven't noticed here, they floated a canoe into the little paddock where the horses were and filled it with hay. And that canoe allowed for that hay to stay dry in that flooded situation and provide those livestock with some feed.
And the water was flowing, so it was virtually uncontaminated other than normal rainwater runoff.
Very good. So this is another image here, a horse who has a blanket on. Probably not the best thing to do in the case of a storm, because remember we talked about getting caught up on things. But luckily that horse is safe and okay.
I would consider that extremely dangerous. The the horse was to fall down or lay down and get its legs wrapped in the blanket and all. If it was inside during the storm and they just let it out, you know, after the fact, then that's one thing we don't know. But I would consider this extremely dangerous
Absolutely.
to keep a blanket on a horse during a hurricane.
Remember, the less you can keep on them to get caught up in case we do experience floodwaters or down fences, the better off we can be. So John mentioned swimming those horses out. So here's an image that they captured while they were rescuing those horses. And of course, they have all the safety measures to keep up with that horse and make sure that they're moving slowly and getting it to high ground safely.
We have several teams throughout the state that SART and the university have funded the large animal technical rescue teams. A lot of them are firemen, but they train especially for water, or if they fall in a ditch, or they train to rescue these animals in a really safe, humane way. A lot of them have veterinarians on staff, but they train intensively to learn how to save these animals from floodwaters and falling into ditches and holes or injured.
Absolutely. So here we're looking at citrus growth. Of course, we know during Irma a few years back, the citrus industry was hit pretty hard with the down fruit. So those trees are not usually growing in a lake, but of course we experience, like I said, such high floodwaters that those trees look like they are growing in a pond or a lake. So the next one, this is kind of that aftermath. And of course, if you're doing a citrus project as a 4-H project, you're not quite to this productivity level. However, our citrus took a big impact in storms, and they tend to because there's only so much that we can do. We learned yesterday that we utilize freezing water to protect from frost, but it's almost impossible to protect our trees completely from the wind. So unfortunately, our citrus, they experience a lot of fruit drop typically in the storm if it's during the peak of that season. But this was quite a devastating loss when Irma came through and hit our citrus industry. And finally, here's another one. These are some cattle that were being moved from wetlands, if you'll believe that, from this picture. And you notice that the dogs that are helping move them, they are swimming. So that water's pretty deep. I believe this was probably Okeechobee area. It's made the news.
It was the Okeechobee area. These cows were stranded. Cows can swim very well. As you can see, and one of the organizations that is involved with SART is the Florida Cattlemen's Association. They're extremely resourceful in helping their own and helping agriculture people. Once again, it's agriculture people helping agriculture people. They got together, a bunch of cowboys and ranch people. The neighbor had a pasture that wasn't flooded. They actually put these cows out on the highway, drove them down to the neighbor's pasture. He said, "You can use my pasture, put your cows here until the water goes down." And they moved the cows there, and then they, the town association got labor, and then they got trailer loads of hay to help feed these cattle in the event of emergency. So there's a lot of things that will come to bear in the event of emergency. Do the most you can and know that there is people out there trying to help. Make sure that you know ahead of time from your county who you can contact, where to go for resources.
Absolutely. This was an incredible story. And like I said, in our area, it made the news. And so it was the next one. So this is a dairy. Of course, our dairy animals, if you have a dairy project, you know that they are housed much differently than our beef cattle. They tend to be housed in a barn. So this is a dairy after a storm came through. And the safest place for them, for that farmer, was in the barn. And luckily, you know, you see the destruction, but the cows are still there. So lots of debris that could come down, barns could fall. So that's where kind of determining where you're going to keep your livestock comes into play.
So dairies are a big issue with SARP because a dairy cow has to be milked twice a day or she dries up and she's virtually not productive. The other thing a dairy cow has to have is feed. They're so used to being fed. They get fed twice a day. They get milked 2 to 3 times a day. So a dairy is very important to us. We make sure that railways are open. During Irma, the railway was bad and we had trouble getting feed to them. And the governor just said, he sent the National Guard and everybody, we will clean that railroad. We will get you feed there. The electricity, a lot of them have went to generator power because they know they're in trouble when the power goes out. So dairies are a huge issue. A lot of those dairymen work together, and the Dairy Association, part of SART, comes into play, and they are highly resourced.
So that is all we have for today. If there are any questions, please have, if you are joining us after the fact and you have questions, please reach out to your local extension office, reach out to your local Department of Agriculture, Animal Industry if they're animal related, and we will be more than happy to help you out with any questions you might have when it comes to preparing for a disaster. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this so that I can see what else is going on. And if there are any questions, please don't be shy.
Remember, we are always here. You can ask a question at any time. There are no stupid questions except the ones that aren't asked.
Absolutely. Yep, the best thing we can do is ask questions and be prepared. So that's all that we have for you today on disaster preparedness. I know Miss Juliana has prepared some amazing facts about disasters. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Juliana.
Thank you, Caitlin and Mr. Court. That was awesome. And Juliana's going to share her screen and share some amazing facts.
Yes, I am. All right, so I have 4 amazing facts on storms and storm preparedness for you. So let's start with number 1. Number 1, if you turn your large animals loose in a field to prepare for a storm, you should build dirt mounds for animals to stand on in case of a flood. So we saw all those cool pictures of flooding, and something that really would have helped would have been some dirt mounds. So if you have the ability, it is a great idea to build dirt mounds for large animals. Number 2, when a hurricane is approaching, smaller animals like chickens should not be turned loose in a field. And we heard a little bit about this already. They should be kept indoors in a sturdy building that is safe from flooding and has proper ventilation. But if you're going to leave, you should never just leave your animals, like we learned. You should never just leave your animals in a sturdy building, even if it is a good building and it's safe from flooding and has proper ventilation. Number 3, the total losses to production agriculture attributable to Hurricane Irma were estimated at $2.5 billion. That is a lot of money. Wow. So that's how much money was lost in production agriculture because of this hurricane, Hurricane Irma. And number 4, Florida has sustained more hurricanes than any other state in the U.S. in recorded history. Wow. So Florida is a hotspot for hurricanes in the U.S. And that is all of my amazing facts for you.
Thank you, Juliana. It's been a great day of learning about storm preparedness. I also want to thank our speakers, Caitlin Mullenix and John Court. Super thank you for taking some time out of your day to share with us on how to prepare our 4-H projects, specifically our ag projects for storms. Thank you so much, and certainly join us tomorrow at 12:30, where we, at the same Zoom link, where we will be talking about community engagement and how we can best serve our community as 4-Hers working in agriculture. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.